Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and this is our free tutorial for the Sony RX100 cameras. I'm going to be demonstrating the RX100 Mark VII. It just went to sleep, but it should apply to the earlier cameras as well. So no matter which model you have, this should help. First, be sure to subscribe to our channel. We have a ton of free photography content, not just about your specific camera, but about how to master lighting and composition. And every Thursday at 4 o'clock Eastern Time, New York City time, we'll look at your pictures live. If you have a different camera, or if you want to send your friends who have a different camera to check out our tutorials, visit sdp.io/tutorials. We have tutorials for more than 50 different cameras. First off, let's talk about the battery in this camera. You might be happy with just a single battery. You can pop open this little port on the side here, the one that's labeled multi, and beneath it you will find a little USB-A micro USB port. You charge it just like you would your smartphone using the cable that came with it, or pretty much any other USB charger, including USB charging batteries. So if you're traveling and you're going out for multiple days at a time, just make sure you have that USB charger in your bag and you charge it up in your hotel every night or even at home. If you go out for a rather intense day of shooting, or if you're shooting a lot of video, you will go through the entire battery. It is very small. And in those cases, you might want to buy a second battery. So here's a link to buy the second battery. I'll show you where the battery is now. It's on the bottom of the camera. So this slides open and then there's a little blue notch there that you push that and the battery pops out. Remember, the contacts will go in first and facing the front of the camera. If you look deep in there, you can kind of see where they are and you'll line them up. Also in here is your SD card. So let's talk about that now. The SD card goes with the label facing towards the back and the pins on the inside. You'll slide that in until it clicks. There it is, and then you can close the door. I can save you some money on an SD card. This camera does not support UHS 2 cards. You can put a UHS 2 card in it, but you will not benefit from the higher performance. UHS 2 cards are faster than the older UHS 1 cards. They're faster, but they're also more expensive. And while you might appreciate that speed, you will not benefit from it. Therefore, you can save your money and buy a UHS 1 card. I would suggest getting a big card, like a 128 gigabyte card, because this camera can shoot 20 frames per second and you can fill up a card really quickly, especially if you're shooting 4K video. The card I suggest is the SanDisk Extreme Pro 128 gig model, which you can pick up at this link here. Okay, you've got your battery and your SD card in there. The battery is charged up. Let's talk about how to turn the camera on. There are two ways. The way I always do it is to pop up the electronic viewfinder. On the left side of the camera, right at the top there is a teensy little switch. The controller is so small on this camera. Pull that down, the viewfinder pops up and the camera automatically turns on. Now that it's on, you can use the rear screen, or you can hold it right up to your eye and look through. The camera will automatically adapt to whichever screen you happen to be using. This rear screen is super useful if the sun is out and you can't see the bright screen. If you want to review your pictures, or if it's a dark environment and this is blinding other people at the club, you can hold it up to your eye, review pictures, and not blind other people. So I really like to use the electronic viewfinder, but at the same time, I'm often holding it out like this using the rear screen. To turn the camera off, the way I do it is I just reverse the process. I just push the electronic viewfinder down. You do not need to push this in. You just push down and it slots right in, and the camera by default will automatically turn off. The other way to turn it on without opening the electronic viewfinder is to push the teensy on-off button on the top here. Just push it quickly. The green light will come on and it'll turn on, and then push it again to turn it off. Notice that the lens is retracting every time it does this. It also has a built-in lens cover to keep that front element protected, even when you're not shooting. So now that we've got the camera on, let's talk about how to format your SD card that you've inserted. To format the SD card is to erase it and allow you to start new. It's like putting in a fresh roll of film. You don't have to format the SD card every time you use it, but if you start to fill it up, you might want to format it so that you have more space. Of course, before you format it, you should copy all your files onto a computer or smartphone or something and make sure that those are then backed up to the cloud, because I don't want a failed computer or smartphone to make you lose all of your pictures. To format the memory card, on the right side of the camera, you'll push the menu button. This opens up the menu system. There are a lot of menu items, so brace yourself. The format option is under the toolbox here. So I scroll all the way to the top and then I'll scroll over to the toolbox. Now I need to go to page 5. So I scrolled down and then I scrolled to the right. Notice this is not a touchscreen menu. You can't swipe or do any of this. There's no searching, any of that. Your only option is to go page by page by page until you find the menu item that you want. Now I'll scroll down here to Format, select that, and then I'll scroll up and select Enter. And when I do that, it will format the card and the card will be clean and ready to use. I'm not going to format it right now. I have some pictures on there I don't want to lose, but I just wanted to show you where it was. Let's talk a little bit more about the electronic viewfinder. Showed you earlier that I'll push this side trigger to pop it up. And when you put your eye up, you'll see the exact same things you see on the rear screen. The only tricky part to this is that there is a diopter on top of it. It's a little dial here that might be hard for you to see, but it just swivels to the left and right. And if it's in the wrong position, everything's going to be blurry on the rear screen. This diopter basically is like adjusting your glasses prescription. So it's kind of like you're at the eye doctor and you'll put it up and you'll look at the numbers on the lower part of the EVF. Don't look at the scene, but rather look at the numbers and push it left or right until everything is as sharp as possible for you. If you sometimes wear glasses, you sometimes wear contacts, you might need to adjust it between each use. If you switch between multiple users, they probably have slightly different vision than you, and so every person might need to adjust it when you pick it up. The tilt screen. Oh, I just closed the EVF and that turned the camera off. The tilt screen is really, really useful. It tilts up and down, but not to the side. So if you want to shoot low, like you're shooting some flowers, you could tilt it out like this and hold it low. If you want to shoot over a crowd so that you can see above you, you can tilt it back like this and shoot over the cloud. It will also tilt all the way forward so that you can take a selfie. Look, there I am, me and Justin. Okay. As you're looking at the back screen, by default, there's probably a whole bunch of confusing information on there and you don't necessarily know what that means. You can push Disp to change the display settings. This is the directional pad. It's also your main dial. It spins, but you can also click it up and down. So if I click up where it says Disp, I will change the information that is shown in the scene. And as I push it multiple times, you can see it rotates, it cycles through a set of 4 or 5 different screens. This default screen shows you your camera settings. It shows you the number of shots remaining, whether you're on a single or continuous shutter, the focusing type, the focusing points, as well as like I'm shooting JPEG fine and it's got stabilization turned on and that's my battery status up there. If I push it again, it's a more minimal display, something that I prefer. I don't need to see all of that all the time and I'd rather see more of the scene. If I push it again, now it's showing me a histogram and the histogram tells me the overall brightness of the scene, how much bright and how much dark I have in the scene. Parts of the histogram over to the right there indicate that there are parts of the scene that might be overexposed. When there's a spike in the histogram to the left, that means parts of the scene might be underexposed like they are here. So as I kind of move between dark and bright here, you can see the histogram is moving around as the camera automatically adjusts the exposure. For more information about this, check out, I have a book called Stunning Digital Photography and I talk about histograms in chapter 4. It's really useful information. So I'll push up Disp here again, and you can see now it's showing me an electronic level. That's really good, especially for landscape photography, especially if you're at the beach. If you have shoreline or buildings, like big straight lines, you want to make sure that your photo is level. Hit Disp until you see that, and then when it's green like that, it's level. Press Disp again, and now it takes all the photo taking part away and shows you just your camera settings. So if you just want to get some settings dialed in and you want the text to be a little bit bigger, this screen is particularly useful for that. And if I push it again, it just goes back to where we started. Let's talk about the physical ports on the camera. Earlier, I showed you the micro USB port. This micro USB port is useful for charging the camera, of course, but you can also use it for transferring pictures. I don't necessarily recommend that. For most of the time, I would take out the memory card and put it into a memory card reader. I just find that quicker and easier, but some people do like the USB port. It's a slow USB port, so if you transfer pictures that way, it will take a long time to transfer them. Directly above that, we have a microphone port. If you have the Mark VII version of this camera, if you have an earlier version of the camera, you probably don't have a microphone port. That's for plugging in a microphone. And it takes just a standard microphone. One challenge with using a microphone with this camera is that it does not have a shoe. It does not have like a flash shoe that you would normally put the microphone into. What you can do is you can buy little attachments that go onto the tripod mount on the bottom, and they'll allow you to mount a microphone to it. So you can plug a microphone in, but you don't necessarily have anywhere to put the microphone. And then this third door down here, let's pull this open. This is a micro HDMI port. You'll probably never use this. You could get a micro HDMI to HDMI cable and then hook this up to your TV, and then you could show whatever was on the camera on a TV if you wanted to do like a slideshow for your whole family or something. But most people will probably never ever use the micro USB port. Let's talk about the different focusing modes on this camera. This camera, the Mark VII version, has pretty amazing focusing. The earlier versions have progressively worse focusing depending on which particular model that you have. To change the focusing mode, we're going to introduce this FN button here. The FN button is really, really useful. So I'll hit FN here and scroll over to this second box. It's labeled focus mode and it shows AFA currently. To change it, I will simply use the scroll wheel to switch between these different modes. AFS is AF single. That's for focusing on a still stationary object. AFA is like automatic AF, and it lets the camera decide whether the subject is still or moving. AFC allows the camera to track moving subjects, and it's what you would use for sports. If you have the RX100 Mark VI or RX100 Mark VII, they have powerful enough focusing systems that I would recommend using AFC all the time. If you have the Mark V or earlier versions, I would either use AFA or switch between AFS and AFC, depending on whether your subjects were still or moving. If you go further, you'll see we have DMF or MF mode. DMF allows for autofocus, but you can take over autofocus and do manual focus. And then MF is, of course, full-time manual focus. This is not a camera that I would ever want to manually focus. This is something I would always use autofocus for, but there is manual focus there if you want. So this is a Mark VII version of the camera, and for that reason, I'm going to switch it to continuous AF mode, and then I'm pretty much going to leave it there for the whole lifetime of the camera because that works just great. Let's talk about the focusing points on the camera. By default, the camera is set up to focus anywhere in the frame. And if I hold down the shutter button halfway, you can see the camera starts to focus. By the way, this is the shutter button on top here. You can push it halfway to focus or push it all the way to take pictures. So as I push it halfway, you can see the camera is just kind of deciding where it wants to focus. And for some reason, it really likes the T and focus points, but it kind of moves around. So maybe I wanted to focus on the F up there. The camera's never going to decide to do that. Before we can select an individual focusing point, we have to change the camera's mode. By default, the camera comes in this green auto mode, which is fine if you have no idea how to use a camera. But now you're watching a tutorial, you know how to figure this stuff out. We never need to go back into auto mode. Instead, we're going to go into P mode, which is program mode. P mode's like exactly like the auto mode, except it gives you more control. Auto mode actually like hides a bunch of useful stuff. So we'll spend the rest of the time in P or other modes. Now that I'm in P mode, I can change and select an individual focusing point. I'm gonna do it the same way you do a lot with this FN button here. So I'll select that FN button. Now I'll scroll to the third item and select that. Notice this time I'm pushing the button. This opens up a separate menu, which gives me a few more options. It's a little bit more detailed than just scrolling left or right with the wheel. So by default, we're at wide. My favorite option on the Mark VII and Mark VI versions of the camera are to use the tracking options, which are the very last option. And tracking wide would track moving objects anywhere in the frame. But again, I want to select a specific focusing point. I find that most useful. I'm going to scroll left here and show you a couple of different options. Tracking center has the focusing point always in the middle. And so it'll always focus in the middle, which might not be where you want to focus, but especially with the Mark VII version of the camera, I can put that center focusing point wherever I want, have to press the shutter, and then recompose the picture. And it will keep my focusing point selected even if it moves out of the center because it's tracking it. You won't find that behavior on early versions of the RX100 though, so you should select a different option, which we'll do now. I'll hit that FN button again, go to that third point here, This time I'm going to scroll to Tracking Expand Flexible Spot. This will allow me to move the focusing point around. You can see now I can use the controls here to move it anywhere I want in the frame, including over to the F. And now you can see I'm tracking the F and I can take a picture of it. So now that I've taken a picture, I then can't just move the focusing point with the dial here like I just was. You can only do that if you've gone into the FN menu and selected the focusing point menu item, and that's kind of a slow process. What if you just want to select the focusing point? With that selected, I can touch the screen and it will switch the focusing point and lock onto it as I'm moving the camera around. Earlier versions of the RX cameras didn't have the touchscreen, and so you wouldn't be able to rely on that. The new ones do, though. On the earlier versions, most people would just use the wide automatic focus point selection and then just keep your fingers crossed and hope that the camera focuses where you want it to. If you're using the electronic viewfinder, you would need to go into the menu items to enable the screen to act as a focusing point while you're using the electronic viewfinder, and we'll cover that in just a little bit. So for my own purposes, because this is the Mark VII version of the camera, I actually prefer to use the center focusing point and never change the focusing point. So I'm going to switch back to that now. When I've worked with it, trying to individually select the focusing point in different parts of the frame, I found it just a little bit more cumbersome, and instead I just like to track and focus and recompose. Let's talk about animal eye detect. If you have the Mark VII version of the camera, it can actually see the eyes of dogs, cats, mostly domestic animals, and other animals related to them like wolves or tigers. It's not 100%, but when it works, it's pretty cool. The easiest way to do that is to take advantage of the scenes option here. So on this mode dial here, you will notice that one of the items says SCN. There we go, SCN. And once I'm in scene mode, I need to select from multiple different scenes. To do that, I will hit the FN button and then scroll down to the lower right corner. I'll select that, and it gives me the option to shoot lots of different types of pictures, and it's going to, when I select one, it's going to change a whole bunch of different options. When I select pet, it will change some settings to make pets easier to take a picture of, and it will also select animal eye detect for me. That's the easiest way to get that done. If you want to manually select animal eye detect without having to switch into a scene, I'll switch back to program mode here. You can go into the menu, go to camera 1 here, and then go over to page 5. This very last option, Face Eye AF Set, I'll select that. Now I'll scroll to Subject Detection, the second option, and switch from human to animal. Once you're finished with this, you should switch back to human. It's kind of interesting, when it's in animal mode, it will still usually see human eyes. So it's actually okay to leave it in animal all the time. I don't know. So I'm going to take a minute and plug my books. I have a few books that can really help you out, that will make a bigger difference than just figuring out the buttons and dials on your camera. My photography book, Stunning Digital Photography, has over 14 hours of video that you can watch. So if you don't love reading, it's still a fantastic value, because the ebook is less than 10 bucks for 14 hours of video, access to a private Facebook group where people will look at your pictures and give you help. That's why it's the #1 photography book in the world. You can check it out at our store at this link here, or you can go to Amazon and look at the reviews. I also have books covering Photoshop and Lightroom if you want to get into post-processing, which nowadays is really key to producing fantastic images. And if you want to get deep into photography, the Art and Science of Photography video training series is available only on our website. So check it out, and thanks for your support. Let's talk about a really key camera setting for those people who do post-process their pictures: RAW versus JPEG. JPEG is the format that almost every picture you see on the internet is stored in. It's a highly compressed format. It makes the pictures very small. RAW is this format that captures all of the data from your camera sensor without throwing anything away. So when you look at a JPEG picture, believe it or not, the camera has thrown away a lot of useful information that was hidden in the shadows and in the brightest highlights of the pictures. It's also applied a bunch of editing, like sharpening and noise reduction, that you might want or you might not want. But when you shoot JPEG, you can never undo those things that it has done. When you shoot RAW, you have complete control over it. There's a downside to RAW though. RAW files are much bigger. They will fill up your memory card faster. They will cause your camera to slow down a little bit. They take a little more computing power to actually process. So whether you shoot RAW or JPEG kind of depends, one, on the types of photography that you're doing, and two, whether you intend to edit it or not, even if you intend to edit it in the future. So there's a whole video that I have about this at sdp.io/rawvjpeg, where you can figure out all the differences. For now, I'm just going to show you exactly how to change the setting. Notice my camera turned off because it does automatically power down after a certain amount of time. So I'm going to hit menu here, and then I'm going to go to the first camera tab, and then the very first page. It's so important they made it the very first thing. This first option is file format JPEG, so I'll select that, and then you can see I can select RAW here, or I can have it write both RAW files and JPEG files. That's not usually necessary, but sometimes you want the power of the RAW file available to you, but maybe you also want to store the JPEG files in case you want to just quickly share a picture. If you plan on sharing pictures to your smartphone quickly, you pretty much need those JPEG files. So if you're on the go and you're planning to use the mobile app, remember to select either JPEG or JPEG plus RAW. I'll say, if I'm shooting sports with this camera, I always choose JPEG only. Because if you're also shooting RAW, then the camera will, what's called buffering. It'll fill up a fairly small buffer and will prevent you from taking pictures at high speed. And that is much better if you're shooting JPEG. So sports and other forms of action, like definitely JPEG only. By default, this camera is very quiet. It just makes a teensy little shutter sound for you. If you want to make it completely silent, like if you're shooting a golf game or you don't want to disturb people, there's a menu item for that. I'll hit the menu button. I'll go up to the Camera 2 tab here. Now I'm going to go down to page 10. There it is. And then I'm going to go down to audio signals. And by default, it's set to all. You'll want to set that to off, and then it will be completely quiet for you. Let's talk about the flash and the flash exposure compensation. Believe it or not, this tiny camera has a built-in flash. To turn the flash on, there's a switch here at the back of the camera. I'll just pull that to the right and it pops up. See how cute that is? When you pop it up, by default, it will just always flash. When you don't want flash, you'll just manually just push it back down, and that's how you turn the flash off. The flash is not great. The flash is very close to the lens, and that means you're not going to get pleasing lighting artifacts. Most of the time, especially with the newer versions of the camera, I would just leave the flash off and just use natural light all the time. But if you do use flash, that's how you turn it on. There's one other tip I want to provide, which is to adjust the flash exposure compensation. By default, the camera will just decide how much flash it wants to put out. Take a test shot with the default flash. If the person looks completely washed out, if they're blinded by the flash, you can dial it back a little bit. To dial the flash back, you'll press the function button here, FN, and then you will go down to this second option on the bottom row, flash comp. And then you can scroll left or right. Scrolling right will increase the flash output. Scrolling left will decrease the flash output. Just dial it back. -1 is half the light, +1 is twice the light, +2 is 4 times the light, -2 is 1/4 the light. There's no right answer to any particular scenario. It's just like adding salt to food. Just adjust it to taste. Let's talk a little bit more about the scenes mode on this camera. This camera has a bunch of different modes. You can manually control the aperture, the shutter, the ISO, all of that, but they've also tried to make it really easy for you by providing these scenes. On the mode dial here, you'll see SCN. Once I scroll into that, by default, it's going to be in portrait mode, which is useful for taking portraits. It's portrait mode, for example, will try to blur the background as much as possible. It will try to find eyes on human faces. Some of the other modes you can access by pressing the FN button and then going to the lower right corner. I'll select that, and then I can scroll through different useful options here. The most useful one is sports action, because sports action will give you a faster shutter speed and it will optimize the focusing system for tracking moving subjects. So even if you haven't made any of the settings I've adjusted so far, you can go into sports action and you will be instantly ready for shooting sports. So it's kind of a lot easier than trying to remember, oh, I have to adjust the shutter speed and change the focusing to this mode and that mode. Some of the other scenes, just so you see them, there's a macro for shooting close-ups, landscapes, sunsets, night photography, long exposure, night photography, night portraits, canceling out shaky pictures, shooting your pets, shooting food, fireworks, and then that's really all you'll ever need. So that's where you'll find the scenes. Let's talk about the other modes and get a little deeper into camera settings. So far, we've suggested you spend most of your time in P, program mode. In P mode, the camera will select the aperture and the shutter speed, and by default, it will also select the ISO, which is the camera sensor sensitivity. If you've gotten into photography a little bit and you want to start controlling your camera settings, you can do that with this camera. The mode that I use most of the time with other cameras is aperture priority mode. And for that, it's labeled A. So I'll just scroll this into A. In aperture priority mode, you can control the aperture, which you can see down here, it's labeled f2.8. I'm going to hit the Disp button just to make it a little easier for you to see. There it is, f2.8. To adjust this, I can use the main dial on the lens. So I'm moving this dial here, and it's really convenient and easy to access. And you can see I can select almost any aperture. As a general rule, at low f-stop numbers like f2.8, you will have more background blur. High f-stop numbers give you high background sharpness. However, with this camera, even at f2.8, you're not going to get a ton of background blur. So honestly, there's not much reason to ever put it in aperture priority mode and then select the higher aperture. By default, the camera will pretty much always use the lowest possible f-stop number, and that's going to be just fine. But it is there if you want to experiment with it. I do want to make note of one thing. I'm at f2.8 right now. If I zoom in, I'm zooming all the way into 200 millimeters. You can see the f-stop number changed. It went to f4.5. As I zoom back, it'll go back down to f2.8. That's because at wide angles, the lens is f2.8, and when you zoom in, the lowest f-stop number is f4.5. So f2.8 represents a big opening and f4.5 represents a small opening, and that opening gets smaller and smaller as the lens zooms. It's called a variable aperture zoom. I didn't want you to zoom in and find the aperture changing and be baffled about that. If you have a different version of this camera, some of them had a 24-70 f2.8 lens, and you would not have that changing. If you want to learn more about how to use Aperture, head to sdp.io/fstop, where I go into intense detail. That's free. Let's talk about shutter priority mode. Your camera shutter is the mechanism that opens and closes and determines how long the camera is gathering light. So fast shutter speed, like 1/1000th of a second, is open for 1/1000th of a second, and it will freeze any kind of motion. But if you were to slow it down to, say, 1/4 of a second, me waving my hand, it would just be a complete blur. If you want to learn everything about shutter speed, watch the free video at sdp.io/shutter. But for now, I'll show you how to configure it on this camera. On the main dial here, just slide it over to S. And once I'm in S mode, I can use the dial on the lens here, you can see it here, to change the shutter speed. Now, when it says 60, it's referring to a fraction of a second. So 60 is 1/60th of a second. I can go all the way over to, keep scrolling, it's a little slow. I can go up to 1/32,000th of a second. That's very fast. And in fact, you're probably never going to be in a bright enough scenario to really shoot that reliably. Maybe in full sun you could get some pictures, but you would never need it. I use shutter priority quite a bit on this camera. If I'm shooting sports, like professional grade sports with like really fast athletes, I would shoot that at 1/2000th of a second. If I was shooting my kids' high school soccer games, I'd be at 1/500th of a second. Shooting little kids, you can be at 1/320th of a second. But for day-to-day use, like a portrait, I'd probably be at 1/125th, 1/100th, maybe as low as 1/60th. And then for things like landscapes, I could go as low as like 1/30th of a second if I needed to. Again, you don't necessarily need to. You can keep scrolling to the left and eventually you'll get all the way to 1 full second. And you can see when it's an actual full second, it puts the quote marks there. If you keep scrolling to the left, you can get all the way to 30 seconds. Now, for these long shutter speeds, I know I can't hold something perfectly still for 30 seconds, so you'd want to put the camera on a tripod. But 30 seconds is really cool for capturing things like the stars moving in the sky at night. For detailed information about that, check out the night photography chapter in my book, Stunning Digital Photography. Let's also talk about manual mode. In aperture priority mode, we controlled the aperture and let the camera decide the shutter speed. In shutter priority mode, we pick the shutter speed, the camera picked the aperture. In manual mode, we select both the shutter speed and the aperture. So I'll switch over to M now. And you can see if I adjust the dial on the lens there, it's picking the aperture for me. So I'll go ahead and set that to f2.8, the maximum. Now, if I want to adjust the shutter speed, I can use the dial on the back here. So now I could dial in f2.8 and 1/60th of a second or whatever I wanted just by adjusting those two dials. For detailed information about using manual mode, head to sdp.io/go manual, another free tutorial. Now I'm going to show you how to use bulb mode, which allows you to take pictures for longer than 30 seconds. To use bulb mode, make sure that your camera is in manual mode. And then you're going to adjust the shutter speed using the back dial and scroll all the way to the left. Now, you'll notice that here it stopped me at 1/8 of a second. That's because I'm currently in continuous shooting. You cannot use bulb mode or select a shutter speed slower than 1/8 of a second until you switch over to single shooting. So there we go, single shooting. Now I'll be able to set the shutter speed even slower. And if I go to 30 seconds and then I go one click past, you can see it switches to bulb mode. Bulb mode takes a picture for as long as you have your finger held on the shutter. So if I wanted to take a 5-minute exposure and do star trails, I would just hold my finger there on the shutter for 5 minutes. That sounds stupid, right? Like, who would want to stand there for 5 minutes? The answer is nobody. Nobody would ever do that. So instead what you would do is you would get yourself a remote shutter release and lock it open. Sony will sell one of these too. You can also buy third-party shutter releases. If I flip open this door here, this middle one, the USB door, that's where you would connect your remote shutter release. There's not too many times you want to use bulb mode. I just wanted to show you where it was. Now let's talk about ISO. ISO is the camera's sensitivity to light. And if you ever shot film, you might remember that outdoors you would use ISO 100 film. Indoors you might use ISO 400 or ISO 3200 film. It's exactly the same deal, except your camera will adjust it automatically for you, so you really never have to worry about it. And for me, I just always use auto ISO, and it's nice to have one less thing to think about. If you're getting serious about photography, if you're shooting manual and you want to configure the ISO manually, I'll show you how to do that. Of course, starts by hitting the FN button, and then on the top row next to the last item here, you'll see it's set to ISO auto by default. I can just use the scroll wheel to manually select any one of these ISOs. You can see that the screen gets brighter and brighter as I select a higher ISO, because higher ISO numbers mean higher sensitivity. If I scroll it all the way down to ISO 100, the screen of course gets darker, but I'm going to go ahead and switch that over to auto ISO because that's where I like it to be. After you've taken some photos, you might want to review them, maybe even delete them or share them. So let's talk about how to do that now. Of course, it's really easy. There is a play button down here in the bottom, and you can review the pictures that you've taken. Let's scroll over. I took some pictures of soccer here, and now you can see I'm viewing this picture. I can also pop open the viewfinder and review the picture in the viewfinder, which is a really good way to view the picture if it's bright and sunny outside, or if you don't want to show the picture to the people around you. Now with the picture selected, I can push up on the directional pad, hitting Disp to switch between a bunch of different options. You can see this is showing me the histogram, which is an easy way to make sure that the exposure is okay, because sometimes the brightness of the screen might not make it clear whether or not the picture was properly exposed. Note that I can't simply do this. I sure wish I could just swipe just like you do on your smartphone, but that's not an option. If you want to zoom in instead, you're going to use the zoom dial here. So I'll push that and it will zoom in, and now you can use your finger to scroll around, but you still can't pinch and zoom. So the zooming always has to be done with that. You can also scroll with the directional pad, but at that point it's probably easier to use your finger. If you've been shooting in continuous and you took a bunch of pictures in a row, you'll see a little bit different behavior. This is a series of pictures that I took, and now you can see it showing them as a stack. This is good because it shoots 20 frames a second, this newest version, and you don't want to be like paging through hundreds and hundreds of pictures because you just held the shutter down for 10 seconds, right? So it groups them together, and this makes it really easy. Let's say I want to just review pictures of this kick here. I can now click the center button, and this selects the entire group. And I can scroll through it, and you can see there's a burst of like 5 or 6 pictures here. That's how I access the individual pictures. To jump back out to the group level, I will just push the center button again. Switch between the groups. Now, I can delete an individual picture by selecting it and then pushing the trash can button here. Scroll up to delete and then confirm that I want to delete it. I can also delete an entire group of pictures like this. Press the trash can button, select delete all in this group, and then it will delete the entire series of pictures. If you're shooting sports with this, this is so useful because the worst thing is to take a bunch of pictures and then get home and you have like 1,000 pictures to sort through. If you're waiting for your son to catch the football and score the touchdown and, oh, he missed the first 3 times, but you took 100 pictures anyway, after he misses, just hit play, select that group, and then delete the entire group. That way you can delete it instantly between plays and you don't have to sort through those pictures later. It's just a huge time saver. This is also a really good way to quickly send a picture over to your smartphone. That's a process that we'll go through just a little bit later, but with the picture selected here, you'll push the FN button, and then you can select either this image, all images in the group, or multiple images. And when you do that, it's going to prompt you to go ahead and send it through to your camera phone. Another useful workflow thing you can do to speed up your editing later is if you're scrolling through and you find a great picture that you want to be able to quickly locate once you get it onto your computer or tablet, rate it. Give it a rating of 4 or 5 stars. That means you really like the picture. To rate the picture, select the picture and then press the menu button. This is going to pull up the playback menu. Now, the 4th item down is rating. So select that. And now you can see it says button to rating setting. So select that. And now up at the top here is very, very small. You can scroll to the right and select the number of stars that you want. And then once you're in rating, you can scroll through all the different pictures and assign it the number of stars. Once I import the pictures into my favorite photo editing app, Lightroom, I can quickly sort and just find all my 5-star pictures. And that means within a minute of getting it on my computer, I can have that one favorite picture. Again, it's like the kind of thing when you're shooting at a high frame rate that really makes your life much easier. A few times throughout this process, I've been using the FN menu to make our life easier. The FN menu is just a shortcut to a bunch of different settings. Some of those settings I would never use. Like, I don't see any need on this camera to ever change the metering mode. The default metering mode is very smart. It does everything I want. I'm never going to change it. I will always customize this function menu so that I have quick access to the settings that I regularly change. It's different for everybody. The settings that you change are going to be different from the settings that I change. So I want you to be able to customize this. This is easy to do. To customize the function menu, I'm going to hit the menu button. I'm going to go to the Camera 2 tab and then page 9. And then I'm going to scroll down to function menu set. I'm going to select that. You can see this is the default function menu. And I mentioned I don't use the metering mode, so I'll scroll over, select that, and now I can set it to whatever else I might want. And there are like 15 pages of options here to choose from. So, you know, something I use on a regular basis is interval shooting. That's time lapses, something we'll discuss in just a little bit. I'll select that. And now, as I exit out and I push the function menu, you can see I have quick access to interval shooting right from here. Figure out the way you use the camera. Set all your favorite things to that function menu, and I promise it'll save you so much of digging through those like 30 pages of menus. Let's talk about the shutter and how to shoot either a single shot or shoot continuously. By default, in most modes, when you go to take a picture, it will take one picture and then stop. Even if you hold the shutter down, it's not going to take a second picture. I find even in just regular shooting, I prefer to snap off 2 or 3 pictures at a time. Sometimes you're taking a picture of the kid and you take one picture and that picture is them like this. If you were to have rattled off 3 pictures, you'd have one picture where they had their eyes open. So it never hurts to take a few pictures. It's free, right? It's digital. You don't have to pay for film. So I almost always switch from a single shutter to a continuous shutter. This is easy to do. The easiest way is just to push right on the dial here. You can see this teeny tiny little icon there. It looks like a stack of copy papers. That allows you to change the drive mode. If you forget that, another way to get into the same menu is to hit the function menu and then go to the one on the left here, upper left, and then select that. This allows you to select the drive mode. This is going to vary from RX model to RX model. The one that I use most frequently is continuous shooting high. On the RX-7 model, that is 20 frames per second. So you wouldn't want to shoot a portrait at 20 frames a second. You'd end up with a lot of unnecessary pictures, but that's perfect for shooting soccer, football, baseball, whatever, because you can pick the like definitive moment. For standard shooting, travel shooting, landscape shooting, I would probably pick continuous shooting low. So as I select that, I hold the shutter down and you can hear, well, you can see that black frame around the edge is indicating that it's taking a picture. So it's probably taking like 4 or 5 pictures per second right now. The number of pictures it takes is going to vary depending on your camera model. But pick the one that's at the pace that you kind of like. I always leave it set to continuous shooting. On this RX7 model, you also have access to a burst mode that can shoot at up to 90 frames per second. That's really fast. It will only do 90 frames per second for like half a second though, like for a very brief period of time. So you have to like time it perfectly. But if you want to catch, you know, your kid hitting the ball with the baseball bat, that like split second, that's the best way that you're going to do it. To access that, again, you'll go into that same menu item here, and it's just one below it. You can see here, single burst shooting, mid, or I can scroll left and right, select high, mid, or low. On the Mark 7 version of the camera, high is 90 frames per second, mid I think is 60, and low is 30 frames per second. If you want lower than that, like 20 frames per second, you would go up here to continuous shooting. So once I select the burst mode here, I'll try to be exciting. I'll move my hand around, and then I just hold the shutter down, and it's going to take just a whole bunch of pictures. And then let's see if we review it. I'll go into the group. Whoa, such action. Okay, it only took like 5 pictures, but you get the idea. It took them at a very high frame rate. Let's talk about the delayed shutter. You can push the shutter and it won't take another picture for a second or 5 seconds or however long you want it to. That's useful for 2 scenarios. If you have the camera on a tripod and you want the steadiest, sharpest picture possible, you would put on a delayed shutter, because when you push the shutter, you shake the camera just a tiny amount. So to turn on the delayed shutter for taking, say, a tripod shot, what I would usually do is I would go into the drive mode, just as we did before, and then scroll down to self timer. And here, if I scroll left and right, you'll see I have a bunch of different options. So for something where I want the sharpest pictures possible, I would select self timer continuous 2-second delay for 5 images. And when I select that, I'll push the shutter and it's going to wait 2 seconds. And then it's going to take 5 pictures in a row. One of those might be a little bit sharper than the others. And since it doesn't cost me anything, I could sort through those 5 pictures and make sure that I had one that was ideal. If you want to put your camera on a tripod and then run around with your family and put your arm around them, 2 seconds, I'm not that fast. I need more like 10 seconds. So for that, what I would do is, again, FN, I'd go into the drive mode, and instead of selecting 2 seconds, I would select like 10 seconds and maybe take 3 or 5 images. Taking more pictures after that delay will improve the chances that everybody will have their eyes open. So that's just a good way to do that. Bracketing is a process of taking multiple pictures at different exposures. If you're familiar with HDR, or high dynamic range, that is a post-processing technique that can take an underexposed picture that's dark and an overexposed picture that's bright, and then blend the best parts of those 2 pictures together to get a picture that represents the way our human eye sees the scene. Because if you've ever been looking at a sunset, it's no problem for you to see your friend sitting next to you and that setting sun. But if you take a picture of the sunset, your friend's face would be completely dark and the sun would be completely bright. HDR and bracketing together allow you to capture the scene with more reasonable dynamic range so you can actually see both subjects. I describe this in depth in my book, Stunning Digital Photography. It's a very important technique. Right now, I just want to show you how to turn that option on this camera. It's under the same mode, FN. I'm going to go to that first option, drive mode, and then I'm going to scroll down to continuous bracketing. And the one you want, I'm scrolling to the right here. I always use 2EV5 image. This will take a series of 5 pictures, 2 stops apart. I'll show you how that works. So let's select that. So I'm going to hold the shutter down until it's taken all 5 pictures. Now I can press the playback button and scroll through them. You can see the first picture properly exposed, the second picture underexposed, the third picture overexposed, the fourth picture very underexposed, and the fifth picture very overexposed. I can go into software like Adobe Lightroom Classic and with a couple of clicks combine those into one image that has 0 noise and a greatly increased dynamic range. I'm just gonna take one more second and plug my stuff. Stunning Digital Photography, the #1 photography book in the world, has over 14 hours of video, so it makes learning photography easy and fun. And if you're not happy with that or any of our stuff, I'll give you your money back. You can check all of my books out on Amazon, where you can see the reviews, or you can order directly from us at sdp.io/store. The ebooks start at $10, which is crazy cheap for 14 hours of video. Let's talk about how to record video with this camera. You will see the mode dial here has an option that kind of looks like old-timey movie film. So I will select that old-timey movie film option here. And now when I'm ready to record video, I won't push the shutter. You'll see it'll give you a little description. Instead of pushing the shutter, I'm going to push the record button right here, which is underneath the mode dial. So I'll push that and it will start recording video. And pretty much the defaults will do a pretty good job of just tracking moving subjects and changing the exposure and whatever else you need to be done automatically. But you can also take control of a lot of those settings, choose 4K video or other options. So to do that, head into the menu system here, go up to the top and scroll to Camera 2. Page 1 of Camera 2 is the first movie options. This first option here, Program Auto. That's like using P mode when you're in movie mode. If you want to select manual mode, aperture priority, shutter priority mode, just select that and pick your option. Manual mode is going to be really useful for the more serious movie makers out there, but if you're casual, program mode is just fine. Getting back into the menu system here, let's talk about the file format. When I select this, I'm going to have 3 options. We'll probably never use AVC HD. You don't need that. The default is XAVC SHD. That just means it's like 1080p HD video. Good quality video, but if you have a 4K TV or you some point in the future might get a 4K TV, you might want to record in 4K because it does a great job of 4K video. So most of us should select that top option, which is XAVCS 4K. You really only need to see the 4K, right? Right below that, we have the record setting. Right now, this is saying 30p 60m. The 30p means 30 frames per second, which is standard for TV in the US. It's also pretty standard for YouTube videos like this one. The lower 2 options are 24p. That is standard for film that you would see in a theater or European TV. So pick whichever one you're comfortable with, but generally I prefer 30p. You then have 2 options for either 60m or 100m. This is like megabits per second. This is the bit rate. So 60m will produce smaller video files, 100m will produce higher video files with higher quality. You probably will never notice the difference between them, and thus you'll be happy with 60m because it takes up less space. But if you really want the best quality, go ahead and select 30p 100m. Below that, we have an option for HFR settings. This is for slow motion video. I don't know why they don't call it slow motion video. They call it HFR, which stands for high frame rate. So I'll select that, and now I can select the frame rate that I want, and it's a little confusing. The first option here is going to be the frame rate that you want to publish the video at. So if you're publishing your videos at 30p, which is standard, you should scroll down here and select 30p. You can now select the frame rate that you want to record at, up to 960 frames per second. So 240, you can see it's doing the math for me. It's saying 8 times slow motion. So you're seeing things at 1/8 speed. If I go up to 960 frames per second, you can see it's doing 32 times slow motion, which would be really, really, really slow. Once you've chosen your HFR settings, if you want to activate the slow motion, you'll change the mode dial from the movie mode over to HFR. And now when you're ready to record some slow motion, you will just hit the record button here. Be sure to switch out of HFR mode because it gets like real intense afterwards. A couple of the movie options that you might want to change. On camera tab 2, page 3, movie 3 here, you can adjust the audio recording level. By default, it's going to automatically adjust. You can see the levels here, but if you wanted to make it quieter or louder, just so that it doesn't peak, you can adjust them by just sliding it left and right. Usually, I like to have it so that the very loudest it is kind of peaking just barely in the yellows, just to avoid clipping, but to make sure I'm capturing as much information as possible. So this seems okay, except that I would want to be in front of the camera and checking the audio this way. So the default setting is automatic and it's probably fine, but if you want to take control of it, that's where it is. You can also show or hide the audio level while you're recording. The wind noise reduction, you can turn it on if you're in a windy environment. That's something that you could also do in post, but it does help. Let's talk about how you can record time lapses or shoot in intervals, meaning like you take one picture every 10 seconds or every 1 minute. To do that, I'll select the menu button. I'll go to camera tab 1 and then page 3. The very last option is interval shoot func. This allows you to start time-lapse recording where it will take still images at a regular interval. This option here, shooting start time, is how long it will wait before it starts taking pictures after you push the shutter. The shooting interval is how long between shots. The number of shots is how long it waits until it stops. For me, sometimes I just want to capture as many pictures as possible, and then I will manually turn the camera off when I'm done. So I would just set this to like 9,000 and that would be okay. And then the auto exposure tracking sensitivity. If you're shooting like the sun rising or setting, the brightness of the scene around you is going to change dramatically, and the camera will need to adjust the auto exposure, but if it does it too quickly, the end resulting time lapse would be all flickery. So if you find that you're getting flickery results, you could lower the AE tracking sensitivity, or if you just wanted to respond more quickly between shots, you could raise it. Most of the time though, the default's going to be fine. You can see at the bottom, it's telling you exactly how long it's going to be shooting for, given your shooting interval and the duration that I've set. When you're ready to take your time lapse, we'll go back into that same menu. The very first item here is interval shooting. Right now it's set to off. I'm going to set that to on. And now I can push the shutter button halfway to go back to this screen, compose my picture, and then I'll push the shutter all the way to actually take the picture. You can see it waited 1 second, and now every 3 seconds it's going to take another picture until I stop it. If I am ready to turn it off and make it stop, I can just push the power button to turn it off. Let's talk about sharing pictures from your camera to your smartphone. You can do this if you're traveling and you want to quickly put a picture up on social media, or just in your day-to-day life if that's how you prefer to edit pictures. The first thing I like to do is to start on my smartphone and go into the App Store and then select the Sony Imaging Edge app. So I'm just going to search here, Sony Imaging Edge. There it is. And install it. And you'll notice that it's got 2.1 out of 5 stars. That's an appalling, terrible rating. I don't have any 2.1 star apps installed on my phone, and that's a good indicator of the experience you're gonna have. It's not a great app. It's a flaky, frustrating app. And in fact, I think this is the 4th way I've tried to get it to work, but I finally found a way that it gets it to work. Okay, so I've installed it already. I'm going to open it up. And the first time you do this, you're going to see not connected to a camera. So the way I found works best is I select that, and then I select scan QR code of camera. There are other options like NFC that haven't worked for me so far. Scan the QR code of the camera. I'll select OK. Now the camera comes up here and it's looking for a QR code. We just need to open up the QR code on the camera. So turning the camera on, going to go into the menu, and then on the little globe tab here, the 3rd tab in, I'm going to go select send to smartphone func. Select that and then send to smartphone and then select on smartphone. Now it's going to show me a QR code. It's firing up the Wi-Fi now. There's my QR code. I'm now going to point my smartphone at my camera so I can see the smartphone, so I can see the QR code. I'll select join. And now my smartphone is connecting to a Wi-Fi network created by my smartphone, and it's sending over picture data to my phone. So you can see here, here's a bunch of pictures that I took yesterday. It's organized by date. Here's a bunch of pictures that I took today. It's a little slow. Okay, so let's select this soccer picture here. As I select it, I can zoom in. You can see it reflects the number of stars that I had set if I defined a number of stars. To send this to my smartphone, I first have to select this check mark here. I could now go and select other pictures using that same technique. I can also select just the thumbnails. And then once I've selected the pictures, I can push this button at the bottom to send them to my smartphone. And you can see now it's copying them down. It takes a little bit. These are big 20 megapixel files, so it doesn't happen instantly. Yeah, I got one picture shared, so now I can just open up Instagram, select sharing of a picture, and there's the picture that I just copied over. When I'm done with that, I can select cancel on the smartphone. There is another useful tool in there, which is the location linkage. However, I have not found that that works well enough to bother with. traveled the world with Sony cameras, and I always set up the GPS at the start of the trip, and then I'll end up with 1 or 2 images that actually have the GPS tagged, and then it stops working. And those times when it does work, it's actually a huge drain on both the battery of the camera and the smartphone. So generally, I don't prefer to turn it on at all. I'm going to go over a bunch of settings that I do like to turn on, however, because they can help you out. The first is zoom speed. You'll notice that when you're taking pictures here, it zooms really. It could be faster. If you want it to be faster, hit the menu button, go to camera 2, page 6, and then go down to zoom speed. You can select that and then select fast, and now you can zoom in and out much faster. The touchpad is super useful if you need to change the focusing point with the viewfinder up to your eye. To do that, hit the menu button, go to the toolbox, page 3, select touch operation, make sure that's set to on. On touch panel pad, select touch panel plus pad. And then for touch pad settings, usually I just leave it to right 1/2, which is the default. And now when I have the viewfinder up, I can put it up to my eye, and then I'm going to drag my finger around like this on the screen with it up to my eye. And you'll see the focusing point move all over the place, especially if you've selected an individual focusing point. That makes it much easier. Touch tracking is useful because you can just touch something on the screen and it will track like that. To turn that on, hit the menu button, go to camera tab 2, go over to page 10, the very last page, and then go down to function of touch operation, the top item here, and set that to focus tracking. By default, the camera will take pictures with no memory card, which is completely useless. And I will say I've taken a bunch of pictures without a memory card in it and not noticed it. And then you can't do anything with your picture. So I'd like to turn this option off so it refuses to take pictures without a memory card, so I know to go get the memory card. To change that option, go into the menus, go to camera tab 2, page 5, and then release without card, and set that to disable. Another option I like to change is the delete confirm. By default, when I review pictures and I want to delete them, it selects cancel by default, but I want it to select delete by default because it just saves me a single key press, and it means I can delete pictures a little bit quicker. If you're worried about accidentally changing pictures, the default is good for you. But if you're worried about like workflow and getting through a shoot as fast as possible, delete confirm will speed you up. So it's under the toolbox, and then I'll go to page 2, and then this second option down, delete confirm, I set that to delete first. Another option you might want to change, if you are not worried about battery life, if you always have this camera on a charger and you don't do long extended shoots, you can improve the display quality at the expense of a little juice. Hit the menu button, go to the tools icon here, and then go to page 2, and then display quality. Switch it from standard to high. It's at standard by default. Finally, maybe the most useful custom setting is My Menu. This very last tab up here, the one with the star, is a custom menu that you can create with just the menu items that you access all the time. It's painful to go through something like 20-something different pages of menus. So go to this star, select the first item, add item, and now you can select all those options that you select on a frequent basis. And you can see that this mirrors the regular menu system. So for example, I regularly reformat my cards. I would need to go to one of the last pages. There it is. Wait, there it is. And select format. And now I'm selecting where in the menu it's going to be, but this is the first one, so it can only go there. Let's also select copyright info just so we can see how you can add multiple items. Great, now I have 2 menu items added to it. I'm going to select the menu button to go back. And now you can see when I go to the My Menu tab here, page 1 has format and copyright info in it. So as you access menu items and you find yourself losing track of those menu items, make a mental note to add it to My Menu so the next time you need it, it'll be there for you. That's it. That's the end of my tutorial. If you have follow-up questions, I might be able to help you, or maybe somebody else watching this video will know how to answer the question. If you have your own tips that you've used from real-world usage of the RX cameras, I'd love to see it in a comment down below, and it can also help other people. Be sure to subscribe to this channel. Tons of free photography tutorials that will help you take great pictures. A live photo review every Thursday at 4 p.m. New York City time, and lots more fun stuff. And of course, check out our books built in with over 14 hours of video, stunning digital photography, the #1 photography book in the world. Look for it in Amazon or search for my name, Tony Northrup, at Amazon, and you can find these books. Or head to sdp.io/store. The books start at $10 and they can really take your photography to the next level. We also have some cool t-shirts and other little fun things there. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.